Hey, it's history hit again. Come on, let's roll the dice. Let's roll the dice. Is it going to be a hit or a miss? A hit or a miss? 14 is not bad. Is it a hit? The unification of Japan, the history behind Assassin's Creed Shadows. Ooh, I've got a few things to say. But let's see, seems like it's different from usual. Do they have some guests?
Welcome to Echoes of History, a Ubisoft podcast brought to you by History Hit.
Ubisoft podcast. Not starting strong. Not starting strong.
This is the place to explore the rich stories from the past that bring the world of Assassin's Creed to life. I'm Matt Lewis. Join me as we venture into the...
You know what? I'm going to be honest with you guys. This looks like a sponsored episode. So let me see if Ubisoft paid for this, because already, let me see, Matt Lewis sheds light on the world's Assassin's Creed Shadows by providing a snapshot of the chaos and culture of the Sengoku warring state, period in feudal Japan. He interviews experts from across the globe, at least it's not experts from Ubisoft, to explore what it was like to live in medieval Japan, which would be, in theory, a really intriguing and fun question to ask. To give an overview of the civil wars that first tore apart in the unified Japan and the man who dominated the era, Oda Nobunaga. Echoes of History is a Ubisoft podcast, brought to you by History Hit. I wonder if they're being paid for this.
The heart of an era that has shaped legends. Assassin's Creed Shadows takes place in 1579 in medieval Japan. It's a seminal period in Japanese.
There will be some people that complain about using the term medieval in combination with Japan. I don't have a problem with that. I think it's fine to use it. Personally, I prefer to say feudal Japan, but if people say medieval Japan, I'm not going to be my usual pedantic and go like, technically it's not medieval, because at the end of the day, some historians do, some historians don't. Then again, late 16th century, I wouldn't call it medieval. If I really have to be pedantic then.
History, renowned for its samurai and shinobi, or as we might know them better.
Of course, you know me, I have made a very, I want to say, centrist, you could say, unbiased, non-political take on the idea of Yasuke. So on this channel, when it comes to Yasuke, you will not find the idiots that will, at the split second you ask a question, will call you racist and bigot. You won't find that, but you will also not find someone who screams woke at anything without having done actual research on the topic. So kind of a little bit of a middle ground position on these matters. When it comes to Yasuke, of course, he was a historical character. We know that. We have discussed that. Was he a samurai? Debatable. The real answer to that, we don't know. Definitely, though, I do not think that the representation we have of Yasuke in the game is coherent to history, in the sense that we have no reason to believe that he was wearing full-on samurai armor, even if he had been titled, and absolutely he wouldn't have fought like a Japanese kenjutsu practitioner, as we see in the game, so that as well is kind of a little bit of a weird thing. Contrary to what some haters say, he wouldn't have been just a slave or just a weapon carrier. No, his position of carrying the weapon of the man himself, Nobunaga, was a position of honor, oftentimes called in the sources kohe, so a little bit similar to a high-level squire, so not just a slave. With that being said, this is not a good representation of a Japanese samurai. So when you say the word samurai, I would put, out of respect for the Japanese, a Japanese samurai rather than Yasuke. But here we are.
For its samurai and shinobi, or as we might know them better, ninja. It's a time rich in history, culture and stories. So I wanted to spend some time exploring this fascinating chapter in history by speaking to experts from across the globe.
Please.
We'll navigate the intricate landscapes of power and ambition which you'll be able to explore in Assassin's Creed Shadows, and introduce you to the
100% is reading a script. 100% this is sponsored by Ubisoft. Well, let's say 99%.
major figures who dominated and defined the era. In this episode, Dr. Chris Harding from the University of Edinburgh will help us understand the warring states of the Sengoku period and the unification of Japan.
Please.
Nate Ledbetter from Princeton University will shed light on arguably the key figure of the whole period, who you'll be able to encounter in the game. And Dr. Kate Kitagawa
Oda Nobunaga
will give me a taste of what it would actually be like to live in medieval Japan. And
she's a lovely, lovely smile.
whether being a samurai was all it's really cracked up to be. Let's dive into the echoes of history.
1467, 1568. Yeah.
Okay, Chris, can you help us to locate Assassin's Creed shadows in the world? We know we're in Japan. We're in the Sengoku period. What does that mean in terms of when we are? And I guess for a bit of
very end, I mean, you're really in the tail end of the Sengoku period, almost in the Edo Jidai.
Context, can you tell us a bit about what else might be happening in the world that we might be familiar with?
Yes, so this is the 1460s in Japan, running for at least a century into the 1560s, and some historians would give it another few years after that. So at least a century or more of this all against all warfare between some of the different fiefs that we're going to be talking about.
Yeah.
And for context elsewhere, you've got the Tudors in England, beginning with Henry VII's seizure of the crown in 1485. You've also got, I suppose, almost but not quite midway between England and Japan, India, where from the 1520s you have the rise of the Mughal dynasty.
I actually like the framing of that the professor is providing now. I think that's pretty nice.
Who are in power there for a good couple of centuries. So relative dynastic stability in England and India, but pretty much chaos in Japan.
Sounds like an ideal place to set an Assassin's Creed game. Yeah. And what was feudal medieval Japan like before the upheavals of the Sengoku period? How is Japanese society ordered?
Right.
So for a while, for a few centuries,
imperial
thinking
power,
about maybe the 600s through to around 1100 or so, Japan is ruled more or less by an emperor based in what we now call Kyoto, alongside an aristocracy who most of whom are based in...
the reason why he's saying what we now call Kyoto is because it was Heian-kyo in period. That was actually Heian-kyo, and the imperial power was the, believe it or not, topic of my dissertation thesis at university when I graduated.
Kyoto, and own these vast tracts of land elsewhere. And then across the 1100s, you have the rise of these warrior bands, who initially are just employed by aristocrats as bodyguards in Kyoto, or to look after their concerns out in the countryside. And I think that partly explains why you get the rise of warrior bands who, after a while, don't just work for an aristocrat.
Now, of course, in this case, the editor is showing some footage from the game, but to keep in mind that this is a very late version of a samurai anyways, because of the sort of armor that we see him wearing, which wouldn't have been a thing at the very beginning of samurai history, of course.
Employer, but actually have loyalty to one another within their group. So this concept of vassals starts to develop. This gets to the point actually from the 1100s, the late 1100s onwards, where Japan is ruled de facto by warrior governments, what we would call shogunates. The Kamakura shogunate from the late 12th century through to the early 14th, and then the Ashikaga shogunate after that. So just before this era of chaos breaks out, Japan has had a few centuries of warrior rule.
During those shogunates, does the position of the emperor still exist? Is he still there? Or
it's more of a formal figure. I mean, once you have the shogunate and the shogun in power in Edo, by the way, so modern day Tokyo, that's the de facto rule. That's what the power is, and the emperor is mostly a puppet at this point.
Or is he pushed aside completely during those periods?
So the emperor is always there in Kyoto. The notion of a shogun, it means something like barbarian crushing generalissimo. So there in the title is the fact that this individual officially works for the emperor. His role is to go out there and crush the emperor's enemies. But in fact, it's the shoguns who organize taxes, the shoguns who says who gets which pieces of land.
Exactly. So if the emperor was like, I don't like that, the shogun would completely ignore that. Like, they wouldn't even say it at this point.
Shoguns who issue these legal codes and oversee a system of judgment. So in every meaningful way, the shoguns are in charge.
And so
Absolutely correct, yes. Great, good professor. Finally, you'd be like, but of course he's a good professor. And people are like, of course, if he's a professor. No. On this channel, we've seen it. Professors pushing complete, utter nonsense. So I'm happy that that's not the case up to this point.
That's the role and the position of a shogun. Essentially, he's the head of government.
high
Just
general.
thinking of another couple of words that might crop
Head
up.
of government, but is also a military guy. It's kind of close to the magistrates in ancient Rome. In fact, if you think about it, they were both magistrates in the legal sense, in the bureaucratic sense, but they were also general military leaders, particularly in the early stages of magistrates in ancient Rome. So yeah, it's actually kind of similar to that. Involvement of the bureaucratic aristocrats and the government figures into the military, kind of fusing together.
But when we think about medieval Japan, what is a samurai? I mean, samurai has got to be a word that everybody knows, but what does it really mean?
So it's going to go with the servant original meaning, I suppose.
So it comes from the verb
Saburao.
meaning to serve. So initially, the ethos was that these people were trained bodyguards, so they might stand outside the door of a particularly high-strung aristocrat. And it's the sense of being, I think, a professional warrior on that basis and passing on those skills to the next generation. The key change that I think happens across the 1100s is that the object of loyalty for the samurai changes from being the employer who pays them to actually being a senior member of their band, maybe related by blood. And you start to have these hierarchies within the samurai. That really is the focus of their loyalty, of their entire ethos. So the whole samurai culture that develops is quite divorced from this idea of basically a paid bodyguard, which is how they begin. In the aftermath of the Sengoku period, once Japan enters this period of settled fiefdoms, which are almost completely independent, the fact that the top samurai in each fief, called the daimyo, is more or less an autocratic ruler with nothing to do with anybody else outside his fiefdom. The samurai
Great landowner, great names. It's a way to translate it a bit more literally.
Structure underneath him, I think, comes to matter all the more. So I think there's that shift all the way through, and it probably reaches its height in the period just after the Sengoku era, I would say.
I think it's one of those things we tend to view it as quite a static thing. We think a samurai is a thing, but a samurai is actually a concept, an idea that evolves and changes. Another word...
Absolutely, and also there are lots of different words to describe. You have the word bushi, which is kind of more of a general umbrella term. In other words, all samurai are bushi, but not all bushi are samurai. It's one way to look at it, because bushi can include warriors and professional, in fact, warriors or half-professional warriors that are bushi, but they're not samurai in the sense of the title. So that's when it starts getting closer to the idea of, for instance, the distinction between a knight in medieval Europe and a professional man-at-arms. Professional men-at-arms who fight in the manner of the knight sometimes are absolutely indistinguishable in iconography from a medieval knight when it comes to if they are successful and they're wealthy and they're well trained. Yeah, they basically look like knights. So the only difference between a professional man-at-arms at that point, even who fight, again, mounted, and a knight, is that a knight is titled, so they're mounted nobility. And that's similar, I want to say, here. So samurai do have several, but they're not identical from a structural standpoint within Japanese society when you compare it to feudal Japan, feudal Europe. But there are some points of connections between the medieval knight and the samurai.
That you mentioned there, daimyo. Can we get a bit of an idea of what the daimyo was and what he did?
Yeah.
Yes. So when the old shogunates were working properly, I was saying a moment ago, you've got the Kamakura shogunate, then you've got the Ashikaga shogunate after that. These are two different shogunates with two different families controlling them. One follows on from the other. In theory, in that system, the way they control the rest of Japan is they send out what are called shugo, these warrior constables, you could call them. So people in their employ, they'll send them out to these provinces and they'll say, you look after law and order for us out there, make sure you hold on to this province. If we need to raise troops out there, you can take care of that. Those sorts of roles for the shugo, who may, when they initially went out to that part of Japan, have had no family connection at all. But what happens, I think, during the Sengoku period is that some of these warrior constables, they actually put down roots in these areas. They make alliances, they perhaps marry, they come to have much more autonomy and control over what goes on within that territory than they initially did when they were parachuted in by the shogunate. So a fully fledged daimyo, which is what emerges at the end of this process, is someone who is in absolute control of his province or his domain and who needs to answer.
It's kind of similar to a governor from a Roman perspective.
To nobody else. So some of the really wealthy daimyo, when we're getting into perhaps the mid 1500s, for example, might now and again lend the shogun a bit of money or pay for an imperial palace to be done up if it's been damaged. But that would be charity rather than something you have to do. So it's that sense of real, complete independence within their fiefdom. At the beginning of the Sengoku era, we have what's called the Onin War running from 1467 to 1477. Huge damage done to Kyoto in the process of this war. It begins as a kind of succession dispute within the shogunate, but an enormous proportion of Kyoto is destroyed in fire. Lots of these different warrior constables from around the country end up.
It's interesting that you mentioned fire, because oftentimes when we look at medieval feudal Japanese castles, for instance, and you may think, well, hold on a minute, they have a foundation of stone, but then everything else tends to be wood. So isn't that in fact a risk when it comes to the possibility of fire? And it absolutely is, but it's also one of the reasons why they are plastered. And that's an interesting fun fact that I usually enjoy sharing whenever we speak about this, whether it be sieges, whether it be warfare in feudal Japan, is that plaster, apart from giving a certain level of protection when it comes to the walls of a Japanese castle, they have protection from the elements, it also gives protection from fire. So it wouldn't be that easy to burn down a Japanese castle. It's not as easy as, oh, just throw an arrow or throw a torch and then everything is going to catch up in flames. Not because plaster was doing that. It was protecting from the elements and fire.
Coming to the Kyoto region to get involved. When that war ends, some of them go back to their provinces to find that someone else has usurped them. And that someone else who has usurped them manages to solidify their own power until they become what we would
there's a lot of backstabbing. I mean, if you enjoy political backstabbing, study the Sengoku period. You're going to love it.
Daimyo, this real independent warlord. And in other cases, the warrior constables, when they go back to their provinces, they're the ones who manage to do that. Because this war, this Onin War, this 10-year conflict, pretty much destroys the idea of a functional shogunate.
If we get into then what the Sengoku period really was. It's also sometimes called the Warring States period. What are we really talking about?
Yeah, that's what Sengoku means.
So it's a period when central authority in Japan has completely gone. So you've still got the emperor in Kyoto, but as we were saying a moment ago, they're kind of impoverished and not really able to do very much politically or militarily. You've also still got a shogun, but they're also extremely poor. If anyone listening to this or watching this has been to Kyoto and has seen Ginkakuji, which is
absolutely, the Silver Pavilion. I went there for my university to study for my university thesis. This was the first time I went to Japan, because I used to live in Japan. I lived there for 4 years, but that was after the degree. So the first time I went there, I went as a student, second year student. I was doing research for my thesis, and so I spent some time in Kyoto, and I visited both the Ginkakuji, so the Silver Pavilion, and the Kinkakuji with a K, which is the Golden Pavilion, although the latter belongs to Ashikaga Yoshimitsu. It's kind of a different situation, but it's sure.
They may have been disappointed to find that there's no actual silver on it. It's instead got this kind of withered wood look.
Yeah, I mean, there are reasons for that. It's also stylistic. It's not just a matter, of course, in comparison to the Kinkakuji, which actually does have golden leaf on the walls. For sure, it's less sensationalistic, but there is also a Zen approach to it. I wouldn't just justify it as, they didn't have money.
Look to it, which people appreciate aesthetically for what it is. But it was supposed to have silver on it. And the reason that it doesn't is that it was built in the 1480s during this period when the shogun's power and wealth was dwindling to almost nothing. They basically didn't have the cash to do anything at all. So against that backdrop, where you don't have a shogunate that can really extend its authority beyond Kyoto, what you have is these regional leaders becoming daimyo, as we were saying a moment ago,
who were military equipped. And that's one of the things. That's why they keep trying to these massive families with their territories and their regions, and then they all have a shot, not all of them, but they have a shot. Some of the most powerful ones have a shot to general power, and they want it. Imagine that. You have the money, you have the troops. Emperor is not going to be a problem. Shogun probably is not going to be a problem, depending on the alliances. Sometimes it does, but whatever. And then who are the actual problems? The other regions. And so, you have the troops to try. They did.
Trying to secure their fiefs, in some cases trying to use warfare, marriage alliances,
the West,
other
and our technologies.
kinds of dealings to extend their power. It's pretty much an all against all. It's not warfare wall to wall for an entire century, but certainly on and off it becomes quite
Yeah.
bloody.
It'd be really good to understand the kind of weaponry and tactics and the military mindset that prevails
Absolutely.
in Japan as they move into this period.
Fascinating.
Early on, you have a sense of samurai warfare where the
But actually, if you want to experience that in a video game rather than Assassin's Creed Shadows, I would suggest Way of the Samurai series, like Way of the Samurai 3. It's a fantastic one. It kind of gives you that feeling. There are much better games, to be honest, than Assassin's Creed Shadows for what I could see up to this point. But then again, it's the Ubisoft spot, I guess.
for a samurai mounted on horseback to call out to someone on the opposing side and to have this what we might think of as a kind of gentlemanly one-to-one combat. But during this period, that changes. It comes to be partly
It was never gentlemanly.
all about numbers. So a really important feature of warfare in this period, I think, is the humble foot soldier,
Yep.
Ashigaru in
He's correct.
Japanese. At the beginning, they're thought about pretty much as cannon fodder. They're not really given much armor, much protection at all. They're thought to be pretty replaceable. They're just pretty much peasants who are fighting in exchange for loot, you know, for whatever they can pick up on the battlefield. But then things start to change. They do become of more value.
Yeah, look at this. This is a fascinating item of iconography that I've used myself several times in my videos. I find it fascinating. So we see a unit of gunners. There is a certain ratio. I think it's either one unit of gunner every 4 units of archers, or 1 unit of gunner every 5 units of archers. I forget. But that just to say that even when gunners were deployed, it doesn't mean that they completely replaced archers. If anything, archers were still the most numerous type of ranged unit. Although once again, that depends from clan to clan and personal choices when it comes to tactics. But yeah, gunners were revolutionaries. We're looking at matchlock type arquebuses, so this is still a very early type of firearm. Look at the so-called chicken wing posture, which if you've had any training, I think, in modern military, maybe you might think, oh, but that's a target. Shouldn't you keep it lower like this? And then the trigger discipline. But all these things are relatively recent. When I was in the military, in the Navy to be specific, in the 90s, there was no trigger discipline at the time. I don't remember them teaching me that. And also when it comes to this, I mean, it's not really that much of a target, and it does give some stability for this type of firearms. But regardless, this is not much of a target with that, because you're not talking about snipers. So they will, as modern military would, you would still aim center of mass. And when you're shooting into enemy line, you just shoot towards them type of thing. This is very, very typical posture for these sort of early firearms. And as you can see, all of these Ashigaru are fully armored at this point. His initial point on the idea of early Ashigaru not being armored almost entirely and just throw them in there, I don't know about that. I'm going to have to need some sources for that statement, because usually if you can armor up and arm up your forces better, it's always a plus. So yeah, cannon fodder exists, absolutely. But still, if you have got poorly armored and poorly equipped troops and your opponent has excellent troops, they have a massive advantage against you. If you have the budget to do it, you will arm them up and armor them up as well as possible. And there were ways to create cheap armor, even if your budget is low. For instance, you go paper armor, believe it or not, many layers of paper, which does work, not as well as metal, but it does work and helps against penetration and slashes. Of course, after the battle, you have to replace it entirely, but still, it existed. You have kind of cheap iron armor as well was a thing.
The battlefield. But then things start to change. They do become of more value because you can see they're being given armor, they're being given specific roles on the battlefield.
Spearmen, for instance.
And I think one of the most important roles they're given, this is certainly true of the armies that Oda Nobunaga runs, is they are trained in firearms.
Yeah.
So in the middle of the 1500s, first contact is made with the Portuguese.
Yeah.
They arrive off Japan's southern shore. And one of the things they're bringing alongside Christianity is firearms. Quite quickly, the Japanese are able to develop their own version of these firearms.
And mass produce them. There is some discussion on whether or not they had an idea of early prototypes of firearms coming from a different source rather than the West. Some people have proposed that. I still stick to the idea of the Portuguese, so I'm in agreement with the professor here.
And quite soon they're on the battlefields. If you were a top samurai in this period and you really valued your life, one of the things you would look for is a suit of armor that perhaps has a
Yes.
few little dents in it because it's proof that it can withstand a bullet.
Very similar to, well, Aquabus Ball, to be specific. But yes, Tameshi Gusoku, so tested armor, it's what it's called. We do see them in museums sometimes, as he says. It has a little dent because they shot it before they sold it, or they gave it to the samurai just to kind of prove to him, yeah, this works, it's going to protect you, sir. Same thing happened in Europe as well, so that's an identical evolutionary step when it comes to early firearms and armor, which is why this idea that some people propose and saying, well, the moment firearms were created, armor went out of use, not true. In fact, if anything, the moment firearms were introduced, both in Europe and in Japan, armor became thicker. And the armor became stronger, or the heat treatment was focused on. So no, armor did absolutely counter firearms at first, until firearms became so powerful. You have matchlock, then flintlock, then, you know, all the different iterations up to a point where old school armor wouldn't really work anymore, but we still have armor to this day. It's not like our soldiers don't have anything. Kevlar is armor, and it does help. And not to mention, a tank is armor. We do call it armor division because a modern tank is a medieval knight in armor, just mechanized. So armor, the idea that firearms cancel armor completely and then that's why we stop it, no, doesn't make sense.
As opposed to letting one through.
And apart from those kind of battlefield tactics and the men who are being deployed around the place, I guess when we think about Europe during this period, we're maybe seeing a move away from castles and castle warfare and sieges. They're becoming less important. Where did Japan stand during this period in terms of castles? What did castles look like in Japan?
Oh,
and how
they're
important
amazing.
were they still during this period?
Oh, yeah, very.
I think castles remained really important in Japan for this time. I suppose for a number of reasons. Most obviously, they're defensive.
Let me add this. Some of the major and most famous castles are from this time, because a lot of the castles we see are not ancient castles. They are Sengoku period castles and sometimes Edo period castles.
Value. So you have these enormous, many feet thick, sloping stone walls, a series of stone walls around the castle.
That looks pretty nice. The architecture looks nice. That's, I imagine, is also from Assassin's Creed Shadows. And I have to say, the architecture looks pretty good. Sekiro was another game that did the castles right.
You've got a series of moats as well. You've got the central donjon, it's called, which can be 6 or 7 stories high.
I've been
so I think
inside a
they were
few.
really important for defensive purposes. Extraordinarily difficult to successfully attack a castle like that. I think what they also provided is a degree of security not just for armies, but also for
the
ordinary
people.
if there were to be a sudden attack on a particular domain. So in some of these castles, what you see is a mini town growing up around it. So these castles, if they were felt to be secure places, they would draw lots of people, lots of different crafts people, tradespeople, merchants, etc., to come and set up their homes and shops all around the castle, which in turn is very useful for someone like Oda Nobunaga, who wants to try to raise these enormous armies. Obviously, that costs money. So if you have a thriving economy around your fortified castle,
Absolutely. The economy is always the backbone of successful military operations.
town, basically, then it allows you to raise the kind of money that you need to gather together, tens of thousands of troops and feed them and equip them. So I suppose in all those ways, castles were quite important in this period.
Do we see a lot of siege warfare during this period in Japan? And I guess how different might that look from European siege warfare at the time?
Now and again, I suppose there's a really good example of siege warfare involving Oda Nobunaga. So in Japan, you have these different Buddhist sects. And one of them, called Jodo Shinshu, was particularly powerful and particularly worrying for Oda Nobunaga because the people in this particular sect could be kitted out at the last minute to become a kind of pop-up army, so that the patriarch, for want of a better word, of this particular sect could issue a statement against Oda Nobunaga, as he did, declaring him an enemy and saying that people would be rewarded in the next life if they stand up against him. And followers of
Kind of similar to what sometimes the Holy See and the Catholic Church did with some of the popes, saying if you go and fight in this crusade, then you will get rewards in the next life. life, or when they said your sins will be forgiven. That was something that religious authorities did use in Europe, and as you can see, speculatively, it was also done in Japan. And there are also the warrior monks, which is another thing.
This sect included some fairly wealthy merchants,
like the mountain ones,
who could effectively equip themselves and feed themselves. So the danger of these pop-up armies appearing almost out of nowhere was extraordinary for Oda Nobunaga. And so he launched a siege against the main compound in Osaka of the Jodo Shinshu sect, which lasted actually...
I appreciate that he says Osaka and not Osaka, because it is Osaka.
For a while. It wasn't entirely successful because Osaka, of course, is on the water. And so the patriarch had allies, kind of pirate daimyo, I suppose you could call them, who for a while would supply the castle
defensive
by sea. But Oda Nobunaga managed to defeat those pirates at sea. And so after a while, the Jodo Shinshu sect, holed up in this kind of fortified temple complex in Osaka, had to give up. So there were quite...
Oh, that would be a nice video game to play, to be honest. An interesting setting for a strategic game.
Remarkable sieges along the way, accompanied, it has to be said, certainly in the case of someone like Nobunaga, with extraordinary slaughter. Just gives you an idea of how bloody and uncompromising some of this warfare could be.
And so for the Sengoku period, we seem to have a situation where the power of the shogun has kind of fractured, and we get numerous local daimyo then establishing their own power bases, but also a lingering drive to bring it back together and for everyone someone to conquer everybody and reunite Japan? Or is everyone happy with the idea that it's split into lots of different states at this point?
I think there is always the idea that Japan has been a single polity in the past and should be again. I don't think there is a celebration of war for the sake of it by any means. And so what anyone at a serious...
Not to mention, it really, I think I would frame the answer to this question onto, okay, who is everybody? Because, you know, the nobles, they always have a reason to do this. Or military commanders and leaders, they have a reason because they are trying to get more power. But the regular people, they're always going to hate war. You can motivate it however you want, but the ideal of a unified country, if that brings poverty, death, you lose your family members, you lose your land, everything is impoverished. The common people are the ones who are always the most affected by war.
This level anyway of influence in this period would like to see is the nation maybe not quite the right word, but the country anyway, brought back together, that Kyoto should be the natural center of power, but that ideally, certainly someone like Oda Nobunaga, he would want to be the person who is fully in charge of that. So although it's a long period of time, it's a century, the Japanese, I suppose not unlike the British actually, have a very long history, are very conscious of that history. You have chronicles, you have poetry, you have songs, you have all sorts of things there in the culture that remind people of what the natural, if you like, divinely ordained state of affairs ought to be.
What sort of source material do we have for this period in Japan? Do we have to be slightly careful about where it's coming from? Is it the voices of the powerful, those daimyo who are in conflict, or do we have fairly good source material?
Both.
That allows us to get to the bottom of what's really going on?
We have, for example, for some of the battle scenes, we have painted screens which show roughly what was going on and how these battles were being fought. I think within some of the larger families, you have...
A couple of these painted screens show what could be Yasuke, by the way, since we are talking about this.
Have chronicles of what their great members have done. Certainly someone like Oda Nobunaga has that. You have individual writings by some of the samurai. For a while, part of the way things went on a battlefield was that whatever your deeds were, if you wanted to be, as a samurai, if you wanted to be rewarded for them, you had to have some kind of a record of them. Yep. Whether you were writing down what you'd done, whether you kept some kind of trophy from the people who you have killed, whatever it might be.
Yeah, and that trophy oftentimes is a head.
Those sorts of things, I think, become...
Or the nose.
Records as well. We also have records from within some of these great Buddhist sects. I think you could say, couldn't you, thinking about them, they are largely elite sources for the most part. but nevertheless, I think it's quite a lot of material, both written and
Not to mention, but then you can try and, for instance, if they mention a certain battle happened in a certain area and then you go and excavate and find material goods, then you've got a double approach, right? You've got literary mention, then you've got material goods and archaeological position, and then perhaps you have literary mention. And so that's how you triangulate and sort of give more validity to what may have been a propaganda piece or may have been something written to benefit a specific warlord that at that time had the political influence to push people to write things the manner they wanted. I have a dedicated video on this idea of is history written by the victor, which is a little bit of a half-truth. On one hand, it's true, but on the other hand, not as much as people think, because it's not just history, it's not just word of mouth. History is also constructed together with other disciplines such as archaeology, such as literary evidence, history of art. All of these things get together to try and help us decode some pieces of work, including ancient historians, that of course could be absolutely tainted.
and visual that gives us a real feel for what was going on.
All right, so that's the first paragraph, I guess. It's a very long video, so I'm going to have to divide it into multiple. Next, we're going to listen to Dr. Kitagawa, and I think they're going to speak specifically about Yasuke, so that's absolutely going to be the focus of my next video on this. So if you enjoy and you still want to keep watching this, absolutely click the link in the description and or the pinned comment. If you're going to go and watch the original video, I would highly suggest you to do so, so you get an idea of what the rest of the presentation is. And then soon I will be, of course, publishing a reaction and commentary to this entire section. And then if you guys like it, we will continue and maybe do the third part, and then the fourth part. As I say, I don't usually react to the entire thing, so we'll skip the fourth part. But I think we can do 2 or 3 videos on this. It could be very interesting, since it's a very interesting topic anyways. Are you going to play Assassin's Creed Shadows? Let me know in the comments, of course, and are you an Assassin's Creed player? I will look forward to read your comments. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. See you tomorrow. Bye.